Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 1, it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give account unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, forasmuch as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault in him. Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled themselves together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime." We'll stop right there for now. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Lord, I pray, thank you for this time we can have in your house. Lord, I do thank you for the opportunity that I have to preach this evening. Lord, I pray that you will use me tonight, Lord, and use this message. I pray that you'll speak through me. Help me not to get in the way of your word tonight, Lord. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. This passage, Daniel chapter 6, is a really well-known passage. If you grew up in church or in Sunday school at all, you've heard Daniel and the lion's den. We stopped kind of short of where it gets to that, but this is the precursor that leads up to that point. And it's always been kind of one of my, I don't know, I have a lot of these, but one of my kind of favorite, I guess, lessons in the Bible, probably because I'm a guy and I like this sort of story. It has kind of a little bit of everything. There is lying and deceit, as you see these men who are looking for a way to get rid of Daniel, so they lie to the king and convince him to make a law simply because they know that it would convict Daniel. Daniel does the right thing where we ended. Daniel does the right thing and follows God just like he did before, which makes these men even more mad, and the king realizes his mistake. Pastor mentioned Daniel this morning in the 11 o'clock message, that the king has grown to where he loves Daniel, and the king realizes his mistake, but at this point, he's made the law, he has to follow it. So Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, and God protects him and comes out of the den unscathed, and then in the end his enemies are thrown into the lion's den. It says the lions had mastery over them and break all their bones. In a guy's translation, the lions tore them apart. For a boy growing up in church, that's an awesome thing. I loved it. It's right up there with the kids who were teasing the prophet of God, and 2 bears came down and ate them. Those are great passages in the Bible. I love this growing up, but because of that, it's been something in my life I've read a lot. It was about a month ago, though, that I read this, and I don't know, I'm sure I've seen this before, thought of it before, but this kind of jumped out at me, and I believe it's something that we need to put some time into studying. What was the reason that we have the deceit and the lies in this chapter? Look at verse 4 with me again. The presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, forasmuch as he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. These men looked for something, an error they could find against Daniel. They searched for the skeletons in his closet and found nothing. It says they sought for occasion. They watched his every move. They paid attention to what Daniel was doing. They followed him, and they watched to see if they could find anything that he did wrong, anywhere he messed up, any errors that he made. That's obvious by the fact that they knew his schedule. When they lied to get the king to make this law, it was something they already knew he did. When they lied to make this law, they immediately went and watched Daniel pray, because he knew, or they knew, what his schedule was. They had watched him in his home. They already knew that he spent time in prayer and when he spent time in prayer. But we see the deceit and the lying because they watched his life and they followed him even inside his own home and could find no fault in him. They watched, searching for, where is this guy's error? What does this guy do wrong? Where is the skeletons in this guy's closet? Even watching him in his own home, and could find nothing. That's quite the statement about Daniel. I mean, that would be an amazing thing to have said about you. Have someone say, I watched you and could find no wrong. I even watched you in your house when you thought no one else saw, and I saw no fault. What a testimony. I mean, the reason they had to lie about this, and the reason they had to kind of spin things the way they did, was they knew, hey, there's nothing wrong with this guy, so we have to make what he already does wrong. What a testimony. I mean, I think if we're honest, very often that could not be said of us. There are a lot of people who kind of have the mindset that they can put on a pretty good show in front of people, and when they're out in public, they act the way that they ought to act, and when they are, in church, they act the way that they should act, but when they're home, well, this is my safe place. And there are kind of a lot of people who take that to mean, well, home is where I can act how I want. I have known a whole lot of Christians who have the mentality that, this is my home, and guys especially who kind of have the mentality, I am the king of my castle and I can do whatever I want here. For Daniel, they watched him even in his home and found no fault. Tonight, what I want to do, I want to spend a little time looking at Daniel and learning from how did Daniel get that sort of testimony. Because really, we ought to desire to have the same testimony. It ought to be important to us. We ought to desire that a person looks at our life and says, wow, that person lives right. So we're going to look in this passage. I want us to notice 4 things in this passage about Daniel that points out to us how he got this testimony. The first thing I want to see, Daniel was faithful. You look at verse 4. Again, we read it just a moment ago. And the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful. Now, I spent some time studying on this because I found the placement of this somewhat odd. Because as a Christian, at least, when we think of faithful, we think faithful to God. And Daniel was. We see that in that he faithfully prayed despite the law that was against it. He certainly was faithful to God when he was brought into the land and made the stand that he did about eating the king's meat. He was faithful to God throughout his life, for sure. But that's not what this verse is referring to. This verse isn't thrown in the middle of all of this saying, oh yeah, and he was faithful to his God. This is saying Daniel was faithful to the king. Again, Pastor mentioned this morning about Daniel, also while preaching on Joseph. The idea of while he was not there under good terms, he was faithful to the king. Remember, these are the men who are looking for some reason why they can go to King Darius and get Daniel taken out of his position of authority. Therefore, the first thing they're going to look to do is see if there is in any way not being faithful to the king. Because that's going to be the easiest way to discredit him is, well, king, he is dishonoring you in this way. I mean, they're looking for some fault that he has against the king that they can use to upset the king because they know the relationship Daniel has with the king. But Daniel was faithful to the king. Let me remind you, and this was mentioned this morning, Pastor was preaching, and I needed him to move on from Daniel because he was going to mess me up here a little bit. But let me remind you, he was not faithful to the king because the king was a good, godly man. He was not faithful to the king because, the biblical stance this king took. No, this king was not a godly man. Also remember, this was not the king of Israel. Remember the context. Again, it was mentioned this morning. Daniel is a boy taken from his home with his parents most likely killed, his nation decimated, and put in a tough situation after their nation has been subdued and their people put in bondage, and he and many others like him are taken from their homes, forced to serve under multiple kings, and none of them served the true God, and Daniel knew that. We can look through the book of Daniel and very clearly see that. It would have been really easy for Daniel to say that it's an unfair situation and the king is ungodly and I don't like any of what's going on. It's not fair, it's not right, and so I'm just going to rebel against it. I mean, he's not a godly king anyways, so he's not my king. I refuse to follow. That's not what he did. He's in a tough spot, and yet under this king, Daniel's found faithful. He was submissive regardless and just kept doing right. It's a definite lesson that we could learn here. I think it's every election, whether you're talking this, the local elections or the presidential, every election you hear of Christians who are all in a panic because of who might end up in office, and Christians who are a mess because maybe who's in office right now, and you hear it every time, and really even in a non-election year with people kind of bashing the president or people with the he's not my president mindset, or people with the mindset that I don't agree with him, so I won't listen to what he says. You get closer to the election year, you're certainly going to hear, all these people with the attitude of, well, what will we do if they get in office? Tell you what we ought to do, just keep serving God. With that, if I just keep serving God, I'm going to submit to the authority God put over me. You don't always like what they're doing, but God put them there. I always think of it this way. This application may mean nothing to any of you, but it does to me, so I'm going to give it because I'm the one standing up here. So I always think of it this way. With plumbing, there is a code book. It is, a gigantic book that you're supposed to memorize. It's ridiculous how huge it is with all the rules and definitions and everything laid out. At the very start of the code book, there is a paragraph that says everything in this code book is subject to the authority having jurisdiction. Here's what that means. You have a giant book of rules that can get completely thrown out if the inspector reads it differently than you do. So you know what plumbers do? And I'm sure plumbers aren't the only ones who do this. You know what plumbers do? Most don't do their job based on what the book full of rules are. Most know what the inspector in that area wants and what they like to see, and they do that. Do they agree with it? No. Is it probably the correct way? No. But it's submitting to the authority. That's what Daniel's saying, or that's what this is saying about Daniel. He didn't like what they did. Again, this is an ungodly king. He would not have agreed with every decision that's made. I guarantee he didn't agree with the fact that he had to be there. He didn't agree with what was going on, but he knew that God put them there, and he was going to faithfully serve. And we ought to learn to do the same. Unless it is something against what God tells us, we shouldn't be fighting against the authority God has put over us. We have to learn to submit. Realize that God is still in control, and he has the people in authority that he does for a reason, and it'll all work out. In finding no error or fault in Daniel, the first thing they found, much to their displeasure, was he was faithful. He was submissive to the authority that God had placed over him. Then to get this testimony, no error or fault, second thing I see, Daniel prayed. And we're going to read some verses in just a minute, but I noticed a few things about Daniel's prayer life. Daniel's prayer life was in response to everything. He was consistent. When Daniel heard the law was signed, what did he do? Daniel didn't go and hide in a corner and panic about, well, how is this new law going to affect me? I mean, this new law goes directly against what I believe, and so, I'm going to totally panic. Again, Pastor mentioned this morning the idea of, well, things are bad, so we all kind of huddle together and just shove the world out. He didn't go and say, hey, this law is bad. I need to go find my other Christian friends and just hide from the world. No, he prayed. He prayed. Also back in the book earlier in his life, the book of Daniel earlier in his life, when he was going to be killed because the wise men and astrologers couldn't tell the king what his dream was and the meaning of it. Look at his reaction. Turn back with me, Daniel chapter 2, verse 16. I'll have you look back there with me real quick. Daniel 2, verse 16, then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. He asked the king, this is all going on, that king has this dream, and the king says, well, all the wise men and astrologers, since they can't tell me what the dream was and they can't tell me what it means, I'm just going to kill them all. And Daniel asked the king for time to pray. That was Daniel's reaction when difficult things came up in his life, was go to God. When he faced problems, and again, over and over, both of these examples in Daniel 2 and Daniel 6 are both things that are his life is on the line. And Daniel's response is, I need to pray about this. Hey, we need to learn to have the same response. I think too often when a problem comes into our life, we have kind of the opposite reaction, and instead of running to God, we run from him. We get that mentality that well, I can't believe that God would allow something like this to happen to me. I am a good person. Why would God allow this bad thing to happen to me when I'm a good person? And we have problem after problem after problem, and we push away from God rather than running to God. If anyone could have had that attitude of, well, I'm a good person, why is this happening to me? Could have been Daniel. Again, taken from his home as a young man and forced to serve. None of us have had it that bad. He is in a terrible situation, yet when difficult things come up, he goes to God. Reminds me of Job. Over and over, his response as things went wrong in his life were, go to God. Difficult things come up in our life. It needs to be our reaction to run to God in prayer. When I was a kid, I don't remember what grade it was, but in science somewhere along the way, you're taught every action has an equal or greater reaction. You know what the greater reaction for the Christian for any of the problems you have is? Your God. So run to him. First thing we see about his prayer life, it was his automatic reaction, but also with his prayer life we see it was known about him. Back in Daniel chapter 6, verse 5, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. And then skip down verse 11. Verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Oh, verse 10 was where I wanted to be. Sorry. Now, when Daniel knew that this writing was signed, so they've gone to the king, get him to sign this. Now, when Daniel knew that this writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. It was known about him. When they realized, hey, we can find no actual fault in him, decide again, instead, well, we'll make something against his God. And they knew that he prayed, obviously, since as soon as they get this signed, verse 11 tells us the men assembled to find him praying. They knew, hey, we got this signed, let's just gather together and head to Daniel's house now, because we know that's what's going to happen. They knew that was the response that he was going to have, so we just have to make that illegal. And when they did, they assembled to watch him pray. It was known that prayer was his reaction. Daniel had prayed enough. The Bible says, as he did aforetime. Daniel had prayed enough in the past that it was known about Daniel that he spent time talking to his God. That ought to be known about you and I. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. I don't know, you think of that, and often what comes to our mind is going out to a restaurant and, being embarrassed to pray for our food. I'm not saying, that we ought to be obnoxious about it. I've known people who are that way. I have been to restaurants with people. I don't get embarrassed about praying in restaurants. I've been to people who have embarrassed me praying in restaurants because they've stood up and make everyone in the room be quiet because, hey, we're going to pray now. Or, get the attention of the room by being as loud as possible to make sure people notice. I'm not saying be obnoxious about it. I'm also not saying that we should try and hide that we're praying. I've been to restaurants with people who have gone the extreme of I'm going to stand up and announce to the room. I have also been to restaurants with people, and I found this one hilarious, that he pretended to drop his hat on the floor so he could bend down and pick it up and closed his eyes and prayed real fast while he picked it up because he didn't want people to know. No, it should be known that we pray. Again, I don't think we need to be obnoxious about it, and restaurants are going out to eat is kind of the obvious example, but in general, it ought to be known that we pray. It should be that the people that you work with know that you pray. It should be that the people who are around you know that, hey, you spend time with God. They may not agree with it, and they may not like it, but they ought to know. I had, is not in my notes, I have working construction. You work with a lot of really rough people a lot of times, and I've had a lot of them over the years who have completely mocked my church, my God, my relationship with God, any of that. And yet I have had many times those same guys, when all of a sudden they have a problem in their life, come to me and, hey, I know you're a praying person. Can you pray for me? Because while they don't agree with it, they know I'm going to talk to God. That ought to be known of us. It ought to be our reputation. Daniel got the reputation that he had no error or fault because he was faithful, because he prayed. Number 3, because Daniel was bold in what he believed. We read verse 10 a few times. I'm not going to have us read it again right now. I think I have it later in my notes to look at it again. I love how the verse starts, though. Daniel knew the writing was signed. This was not a case of that Daniel didn't know what had happened and was caught off guard. This isn't a matter of, Daniel missed that meeting and so he didn't hear what happened and didn't see it signed. No. Remember his position of authority. More than likely, Daniel was present when all this happened. Daniel knew what was going on. He knew that it was signed, and knowing that it was signed didn't cause him to change what he did and go hide in a back room or stop from praying. Daniel knew that it was signed, and it says he opened his windows and knelt to pray because he was bold about doing what he knew was right. This is a hard line. I thought about this a lot while studying for this message, because we're told that we should be submissive to authority, and Daniel was, but now we see him going against it. Here's the deal: we are to be, and I mentioned this earlier, we are to be submissive to the authority that God has placed over us, unless that authority tells you to do something against God. Daniel was submissive, but Daniel knew the only one he was to bow down to was God and God alone. He was submissive to the authority that God had placed over him, but when that authority told him to do something against God, he couldn't. Acts 5:29, Peter and the other apostle answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." Just like we have in Acts 5, Daniel was bold about it. Knowing that there was consequences, because there's always consequences to the choices that we make, good or bad. There are always consequences to the things that we choose, but knowing that there were consequences, and even knowing what those consequences would be, he still obeyed. We need to be bold in what we believe. It shouldn't matter to us what people may think, or what people may say, or what people may do. We need to learn to be bold and stand for what we believe. I know that's not an easy thing. I understand that. Daniel is living in a foreign country surrounded by people who do not believe like he does. This is not going to be an easy time to stand and be bold for what's right. Easy thing or not, it's still the right thing. Daniel got the reputation of being without error or fault because he was faithfully prayed, he was bold, and then lastly tonight, because he believed in his God. Look at verse 23 with me. I told you we were going to read a little bit more. Look down at verse 23 with me. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no matter of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. I just think this verse is so amazing because it lays it out so clearly for us. Daniel's taken out of the lion's den. There's no hurt on him. And then it's like God just wants to make it real clear. The reason for that, because he believed in me. That's quite the statement. You know, there are a lot of people who claim to believe. It's a way different story when you're getting thrown in a lion's den. It would have been pretty easy for Daniel to believe when he was back home. They're still in a hard place, don't get me wrong. They're still out of their country. He's still in a foreign land serving under an ungodly king, and I know that's still difficult, and I know he's still taken from his home and all of that going on, but it would have been a whole lot easier because he's home and he's with, maybe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as the support of those men as well. It would have been easy to believe when he's in his house, when it appeared like, things were going kind of normal, like they always have before. It would have been a lot harder for Daniel to keep believing when he gets these accusations made about him or to the king, and when they open the lion's den and throw him in. That's hard to believe then. To believe when you're thrown in the lion's den, you have to really believe what you believe. It's really easy when you're outside the lion's den to say, I believe in my God. It's a whole different thing when you're falling down into the lion's den to go, I believe in my God? At that point, it can't just be something you say. But a lot of times, that's what we as Christians do. A lot of times, that's what happens is we claim we believe, but if we're really pushed or really tried, we don't. We would say, well, that we believe our Bible, and we would say that, we agree with what it says. We would say that it's worth standing for. We would say we believe maybe what our church teaches, but then when we're tried, we crumble. Or when questioned, we back down. As a Christian, we should want to be able to have the same testimony as Daniel. That requires that you really believe what you believe. I'm almost to the conclusion, but I want to give this thought first. You know why Daniel was able to believe what he believed, like really believe it when thrown in the lion's den? It's because of the time spent with God and the relationship he had with God. It goes back to the fact that Daniel always prayed. That's how you can have a belief in God and in the things of God that lasts through the struggles, is to spend enough time with God. You've built that relationship. You've built that confidence in Him and His ability, to where when you're at the mouth of the lion's den, you can say, no, I know my God real well. And I know He can get me through this. I know He can do this. Daniel had the fact that he could look back and say, God did the last time. Because he had that relationship, and because he had stood for God and God had protected him before at the mouth of the lions, then he can say, no, God's protected me before. I believe. He was able to have that confidence that he could believe what he believed because he had a close relationship with God. If you want to have the kind of confidence where you can say, yeah, I really believe what I believe, even when faced with a trial, even when kind of the worst is thrown at me, that requires a constant relationship with God, a closeness. I have an example. I'm hesitating to use it, but I will. So I know my son very well. I know what my son is capable of. I could pick someone else in the room and take them to do the exact same job as my son. And I can go there and say, I know what Josh can do because I have a close relationship with him. I've watched him work countless times over the last 16 years. I could take someone else that maybe has more experience, but I've never seen. I have no confidence in what they can do. I've never seen them do it. I can have confidence and believe what I believe because I have a close enough relationship with my God that I can say, I know what my God can do. I know He can bring me through. It's where Daniel was. I know what my God can do. The mouth of these lions is nothing. As a Christian, we should want to be able to have the same testimony as Daniel. To have that, we need to be submissive to the authority God puts over us. We need to be constantly in prayer, so that prayer is our reaction to life's problems, and so that it is known about us that we pray. We need to be bold in what we believe, and we need to truly believe in our God. I want to really quickly look at how this ends, and we'll be done this evening. The testimony for Daniel. The testimony for Daniel got him in trouble with this world. It was because of his testimony that these men lied and deceived and got Daniel thrown in the lion's den. And I could see someone thinking, then why would I want that testimony? If that's the result of having a testimony that you believe God and having a testimony that you do exactly what God says, why would I want that testimony if it means I'm going to have to go through trials because of it? Why would I desire that? But the end result is that God is still in control. Daniel was protected from his enemies, his enemies destroyed, and the king turned to God. It looked ugly, but God was still in control. When we serve God, when we have a relationship with God where we are serving Him, there's going to be times that trials come and problems arise just like they did for Daniel. There may even be times that you wonder, is this really worth it? Is this really going to turn out okay? all these things going on, and I don't get it. And it just feels like trial after trial. Is this really going to turn out okay? I guess it's as simple as this. We just need to remember that God is still in control. Look at verse 26 and 27. I'm going to end with this. Verse 26 and 27. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivered and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in the earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Listen, when this thing started, no one, not his enemies, not the king, not Daniel himself, no one thought this is going to end with the king making that proclamation. Now, the end result of this was supposed to be Daniel being thrown in the lion's den and killed, the end. No one thought, hey, how this is going to turn out is that Daniel's God is praised and the king turned to God. So I'm ending with this. I've said that like 3 times now, but this time I really am. I'm ending with this. Hey, it may be that you look at it and say, I don't see how this is going to end for good. But if we recognize my God is in control, it does. Let's pray. Lord, I want to thank you for the truth of your word, Lord. Lord, I pray that you will help us to be able to really grasp a hold of this, Lord, and let it really speak to us. Lord, help us to desire to have the kind of testimony, the kind of relationship with you that Daniel had, that no matter what was happening, and regardless of standing at the mouth of the lion's den, he could have confidence in you, and confidence that you were still in control. Help us to have that same relationship and that same confidence in you. I pray this in your name. Amen.